Welcome, searching souls. Tonight, we shall together turn a sorrow-stained page of an ancient text, a story that time has covered in dust, not because it is old, but because its raw truth makes us afraid. This is not merely a chronicle of a crime, but a mirror held up to the darkest corners of the human heart, to a time when a people lost their moral compass. Prepare yourselves, for the journey we are about to embark upon will dig deeper than anything you have known. We will explore what happens when pride wears the cloak of piety, when love transforms into possession, and when a nation has no king, and every individual becomes their own judge. Are you ready to face the truth? Let us begin. In those days, when the throne of Israel was empty, and the law was but fading characters on brittle scrolls, there lived a Levite among the green hills of Ephraim. His name, if he had one that mattered, has been forgotten by history. He is known to us only by his title. He was no ordinary man. He belonged to the lineage set apart for sacred rites, a man of station, a voice of influence. His house was built of solid stone, every angle perfectly hewn, reflecting the order and discipline he imposed upon his life and all things within it. His reputation was polished daily with resonant prayers and rituals performed with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. He was a pillar of the community, a symbol of righteousness in a world that was slowly beginning to decay. And in that house, between the cold stone walls and the solemn silence, lived his concubine from Bethlehem. She was a flower of Judah, carrying in her the beauty of the golden wheat fields and the warmth of the southern sun. But in this house, her beauty was not cherished. It was owned. She was not his love. She was an ornament to his station, a precious jewel displayed in a wealthy collector's cabinet. When he looked at her, he did not see her soul, with its quiet hopes and silent fears. He saw only the reflection of himself, a successful man, capable of possessing such a treasure. Her life was a long and unbroken chain of silent days. Her voice, once as clear as a mountain stream, was swallowed by the oppressive dignity of the house. Her joy, her spontaneous smiles, withered under the shadow of a husband who cared only for rules, for appearances, and for his own image in the eyes of others. Each day, she felt herself becoming more and more invisible. She moved through the house like a shadow, performing her duties in silence, her existence acknowledged only when it served his needs or convenience. She was not a life partner to be shared with, but a faint presence in the life of a man who considered himself great. And then one day, that shadow decided it could endure no more. Her departure was not an explosive act of anger. There were no screams, no slammed doors. It occurred in a silence that was heartbreaking. One morning, as the early mist still clung to the hills, she gathered her few small belongings, looked one last time at the stone house that was once a hope and had become a prison, and she walked away. She did not run off with another man, as later rumors might have spun. She was simply running to find herself again, to find air to breathe. She returned to her father's house in Bethlehem, the one place in the world where she hoped she might be seen as a person, not a possession. For the Levite, her disappearance was not a wound of emotional loss. It was an intolerable humiliation, a crack in the perfect facade of the life he had so carefully constructed. A man like him, a revered priest. How could he allow a concubine to simply leave? What would the people whisper behind his back? What would become of his honor, the thing he valued more than life itself? A cold anger rose within him, not from longing, but from a sense of violated ownership. He had to bring her back. This was not a choice, it was an imperative. Not with sweet words of love, but with the authority of an owner. His journey to Bethlehem was not a quest for reconciliation. It was an expedition to reclaim his property, to mend the tear in the fabric of his honor. And when pride is the compass that guides the way, tragedy is often the unavoidable destination. Have you ever wondered? When love ceases to be about cherishing and becomes about possessing, when one person sees another as a part of their assets, is it still love, or has it become the most refined form of a prison? The journey from the hill country of Ephraim to Bethlehem was not a short one. The Levite, accompanied by a servant and 2 donkeys laden with gifts, travelled the dusty roads under a harsh sun. His mind was not occupied with what he would say to persuade his concubine to return. For him, there was no persuasion necessary. He was coming to assert his authority. His silence throughout the journey was more intimidating than any threat. The servant who followed behind could feel the tension radiating from his master and could only bow his head in silence. When they arrived at the threshold of the father-in-law's house in Bethlehem, a beaming smile greeted them. The father, a man with salt and pepper hair and the worried lines of a patriarch, rushed out. He embraced his son-in-law, a torrent of welcoming words spilling out as if from a prepared script. "My dear son, what a blessing to see you. Come in, rest from your long journey." But if one looked closely into his eyes, one could see a tremor behind that smile, a flicker of anxiety he could not conceal. This was not the pure joy of a father-in-law welcoming his son. It was the hospitality born of fear. Inside, he saw his daughter, sitting in a corner of the room, silent and small. Upon seeing the Levite, she started, her eyes widening for a moment before she cast them down again, her hands twisting in her lap. The father knew his daughter. He knew her reason for returning was not a simple woman's quarrel. He had seen the invisible bruises on her soul. And he also knew his son-in-law, a man whose piety concealed a heart of iron and boundless pride. He saw the cold resolve in the Levite's eyes, and a chill ran down his spine. He knew this man had not come to heal, but to reclaim. For the next 5 days, the father turned delay into an art form, a masterfully staged performance. Each morning, as the Levite prepared to saddle his donkeys for the return journey, the father would grasp his arm, his voice full of earnest pleading. "Stay one more day, my son, let your heart be merry. The day is still long. There is still good wine. There is still fattened meat." Each night, he laid out the most lavish feasts, dishes he knew his son-in-law favored, and poured the finest wines. He told cheerful stories, trying to create an atmosphere of warmth. What was he doing? He was playing a desperate game of chance with time. He was trying to build a temporary prison out of hospitality, hoping that the gentleness of family might soften his son-in-law's stony heart. He hoped for some miracle, a great storm, a prophecy from a seer, anything that might keep his daughter in this safe haven a little longer. He knew the roads outside were unsafe, filled with bandits and vagabonds, but the greatest danger, he feared, was the man sitting at his table. His hospitality was a prison built of love and helplessness. But the Levite could not be swayed. To him, this lavish entertainment was not affection but a subtle challenge. Each day he stayed was another day his honor was deferred, an admission that he did not have full control. His patience wore thin. He accepted the hospitality politely, but his heart grew colder with each passing day. Finally, on the 5th day, as the sun began to dip toward the western horizon and the father began his familiar refrain, the Levite stood up decisively. He was not rude, but his voice carried a finality that could not be negotiated. "There can be no more delay. We must be on our way." His words were like a pronounced verdict. The father could only look on helplessly at his daughter, her face pale. She did not protest. She rose silently, like a lamb being led to the altar. The father hugged her one last time, a tight, desperate embrace. He could only watch as their figures receded down the dusty path, carrying with him a terrible premonition. They had departed too late, and the darkness was chasing them, faster than the hooves of their donkeys. We often think that good intentions will lead to good outcomes, but sometimes our most desperate efforts to protect the ones we love only serve to push them onto a more dangerous path. Is it possible that sometimes the safest prison we build with our love is the very thing that prevents a true escape? The farewell at Bethlehem was heavy with a silent grief. The father stood at his doorway, watching until the small caravan was just a blurry dot at the end of the road. He did not go back inside immediately, but stood there for a long time, letting the cool evening breeze blow through his greying hair, as if trying to send one last prayer after his unfortunate daughter. On the donkey's back, the concubine did not look back. She knew that if she did, she would see the pain in her father's eyes, and her own courage would shatter. She just stared ahead, down the darkening road where her fate awaited her. The night fell faster than they had anticipated, like a shroud of indigo cloth draping over the landscape. The rocks along the path began to take on strange, monstrous shapes in the gloom. The chirping of night insects only amplified the sense of loneliness and unease. The rocky path slowed the donkey's pace. As they neared the city of Jebus, an ancient fortress of the Jebusites perched on a hill, the servant, a young and practical man with sharp eyes, spoke up, his voice filled with concern. "Master, the day is gone and the night is deep. Let us turn into this city of foreigners and spend the night. At least there are high walls and strong gates there." It was a sensible suggestion, a choice of reason. A visible shelter, even one belonging to a foreign people, was better than wandering in the perilous darkness. But the Levite, who lived his life by the rules and pride of his lineage, dismissed it with a contemptuous wave of his hand. "No," he said, his voice ringing with the arrogance of a man who believed himself to be under a special divine protection. "We will not spend the night among those who are not of the covenant. The seed of Abraham does not seek safety from the unclean. It is better to sleep in an open field than to share a roof with them." He had wrapped himself in a cloak of false righteousness, believing his faith was an impenetrable shield, a sign that he was superior to those around him. He decided to press on toward Gibeah, a city of the tribe of Benjamin, only a short distance away. A city of his brothers. In his mind, it was a holy place, an oasis of safety in a land fraught with danger. There he would be welcomed, honored, and protected by the very people who shared his faith and his blood. It was a fateful choice, a decision made out of religious pride rather than practical wisdom. He steered clear of the danger he could see, the danger from the outsider, only to walk directly into a danger far more terrible, an invisible danger, hiding behind the familiar walls of his own people. Gibeah. The name sounded peaceful. As they approached, the city appeared on a hill, looking sturdy under the dim moonlight. But this city held a horrifying secret. It wore a mask of piety, but within, a spiritual cancer was corroding it from the roots. The people here might still read the law, they might still offer sacrifices at the high places, but their hearts had grown hard and distant from God. The laws of compassion and hospitality had been forgotten, replaced by selfishness and dark desires. As the Levites' tired party entered the city's central square, a strange silence greeted them. The doors remained shut. Lamplight flickered through a few cracks, but no one emerged. Not a single invitation was offered. Hospitality, the most sacred law and the pride of their people, seemed to have died in this place. The Levite, his concubine, and his servant sat there, alone and adrift in the windy square, surrounded by their own kinsmen. The city's indifference was colder than the night dew that was beginning to fall. They did not know that this indifference was only the prelude to a nightmare about to begin. Our greatest shield can sometimes be our most fatal weakness. Can our confidence in our own faith and righteousness blind us to the real danger that lies hidden at our feet, in the very places we consider safest? The Levites' choice had sealed their fate, a bitter lesson in how pride can lead a man to the abyss. Time crawled by in the deserted square of Gibeah. The night wind grew colder, whipping through the concubine's thin robes and making her shiver. She huddled close to the servant, both of them silent, not daring to look at the Levite's increasingly dark face. His pride was being severely wounded. He, a man of the tribe of Levi, was being treated like an invisible beggar by his own Benjaminite brothers. The city's silence was a public humiliation, and a quiet rage began to smolder within him. He had chosen this place, believing in its sanctity, but his reward was only the coldness of closed doors. Just as hope had nearly flickered out, as they were beginning to resign themselves to a night in the open, an old figure appeared from the far side of the square. It was an old man, walking slowly, his back bent from years of labor in the fields. He was not a native of Gibeah, but an sojourner from the hill country of Ephraim, just like the Levite. Perhaps because he too was a stranger, he still held in his heart the old values, the things the native citizens had lost. His eyes, though clouded with age, still shined with kindness and compassion. He was the only man in all of Gibeah who still possessed the heart of a true Israelite. The old man approached the strangers, his warm voice, though a bit hoarse, breaking the cold silence. "My children, why are you sitting here in the night dew? It is late. Has no one invited you into their home?" The Levite, still trying to cling to his wounded pride, lifted his head and replied stiffly, "Thank you for your kindness, old man, but we have everything we need. We have straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for myself, for my handmaid, and for the young man. We lack nothing, only a roof for the night." His words implied that he did not need charity, only the barest compliance with the law of hospitality. But the old man shook his head, a kind and somewhat sad smile on his lips. "No, I cannot allow you to stay out here. To sleep in the city square is a disgrace. Come to my house, all your expenses, whatever you need, let me provide for it." And so, a small glimmer of hope appeared in the desperate night. They followed the old man down a narrow alley and into a modest home. The house was not large, but it was clean and warm. A fire was quickly kindled in the hearth, chasing away the chill of the night. The old man brought out a basin of warm water for them to wash their weary feet, an ancient and meaningful gesture of welcome. He set out bread, olives, and a small jug of wine. For a brief moment, the harsh world outside seemed to recede. The fire crackled, its warmth spreading through the room. The Levite, after being treated with such kindness, relaxed his stern expression slightly. The servant sighed in relief, and the concubine, for the first time in many days, perhaps felt a small measure of true peace. She looked at the old man with grateful eyes. In that moment, he had not just given them shelter, he had given them a little faith in human kindness, something she thought had vanished completely. They had found a refuge, a kind soul in a heartless city. They were safe. At least that is what they thought. Because just as that feeling of safety had begun to blossom, just as they had begun to eat their first bite of bread, a sound came from outside. Knock, knock. A knocking at the door. Hard, insistent. It was not the knock of a lost traveler. It was the knock of a predator that had scented its prey. The atmosphere in the house instantly froze. The smile vanished from the old man's face. The piece of bread in the Levite's hand stopped midway to his mouth. All eyes turned to the flimsy wooden door, the only thing separating them from the darkness that was now roaring and demanding outside. The glimmer of hope that had just appeared was threatened by a far deeper night. The initial knocking quickly escalated into violent, brutal pounding, shaking the very frame of the wooden door. The bolts groaned as if they were about to splinter. From outside, depraved voices rose up, not the voices of one or two men, but of a whole crowd. They merged into a chorus of degeneracy, a horrifying sound that echoed in the small alley. These were not thieves wanting to steal possessions, nor were they wandering bandits. They were the men of Gibeah, the ones who had earlier shut their doors, pretending not to see the strangers. They were the neighbors, the brothers of the same tribe. They were the rotting soul of the city made flesh. A hoarse voice, full of authority and filth, rose clearly above the din, piercing through the door. "Hey, old man, open up. Bring out the man who came into your house. We want to know him." To know him. A euphemism pregnant with sinister meaning, an unimaginable demand. It was the echo of ancient Sodom, now resounding in the heart of the people of Israel. Inside, the warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a chilling terror. The old man was frozen, his face turning from ruddy to a deathly pale. The young servant was horrified, his eyes wide, staring at the door as if it were a monster about to devour them. And the Levite, the man who had confidently strode into this city believing he was among righteous brothers, was now as white as a sheet. The nightmare he had arrogantly sought to avoid in Jebus was now manifesting here, in the very house of his own people. His pride, his shield of faith, had shattered into 1,000 pieces against the brutal reality. The crowd outside roared again, their voices merging into a wave of fury that crashed against the small house. "Bring him out! Don't make us break down the door!" This was not a spontaneous act of a few drunks. Their coordination and audacity showed this was an organized demonstration of evil, a display of the power of darkness in the middle of the night. It revealed just how deeply the rot of moral decay had penetrated this community. There was no more shame, no more fear of the law of God or man. They acted as if they were the law. The old man, the master of the house, now faced a terrifying choice. He was the last line of defense for his guests. The sacred responsibility of hospitality weighed heavily on his frail shoulders. He glanced at the trembling Levite, then at the concubine cowering in the corner, her face a mask of silent terror. With a deep breath to summon what little courage he had left, the old man shakily pushed himself up from his chair. His old joints creaked. He slowly walked toward the door. What would he do? Would he stand firm as a rock, protecting his guest with his own life, as the stories of their forefather Abraham were often told? Or would fear of the raging mob bend his spine, forcing him to make a decision even worse than death? The door creaked open a tiny crack. The flickering torchlight from outside streamed in, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. Through the crack, the old man saw a sea of hateful faces, eyes bloodshot with lust and violence. And in that moment, faced with pure evil, the old man uttered a plea, a bargain that would forever echo through history as a tragic testament to the moral collapse of an entire nation. The question it poses to each of us is this: when faced with absolute evil, when the pressure of the mob weighs down, what price is too high to pay for a false sense of peace? And is there any limit to compromise? No, my brothers, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. The old man's voice trembled in the night, a feeble sound attempting to push back against the roar of the mob. This man is my guest. He has come under my roof. Do not do this disgraceful thing to him. It was a righteous plea, an appeal to their honor and the law they were supposed to uphold. He was trying to remind them of the covenant of hospitality, of the brotherhood within the same nation. But as he looked into their soulless, bestial eyes, he knew that reason and righteousness no longer held any weight here. Their consciences were dead. And then, in his utter panic, in his desperation to extinguish the rage before him, he made an unbelievable offer, a bargain with the very devil that stood incarnate before him. He continued, his voice cracking, "Here, listen to me. I have a virgin daughter who has never known a man, and this man has his concubine. Let me bring them out to you. You can abuse them, do to them whatever you wish, satisfy yourselves with them. But please, do not do this abominable thing to this man, my guest." Listen carefully to those words. Feel their horrific weight. A father, a host, who should have been a protector, was willing to throw 2 women, his own flesh and blood, and another innocent woman to the wolves to protect one man. In his worldview, twisted by fear and a rotten patriarchal value system, the dignity and safety of one man were more important than the lives and sanctity of 2 women. They were not seen as precious souls bearing the image of God. They were human shields, disposable sacrifices to appease a beast. The mob roared. They scoffed at his offer. They didn't care. Their target was the Levite. Their refusal only heightened the terror inside the house. And then, in that decisive moment, as all attention was on the old man, the camera of history suddenly turned to the Levite, the husband, the master, The man who had traveled a long way to reclaim this woman, to protect his honor, what would he do? Would he fight? Would he die with her? He did something even worse. He made a cold choice, an act of ultimate cowardice and selfishness. The scripture records it with a painful brevity whose weight pierces through millennia. But the men would not listen to him, so the man seized his concubine and brought her out to them. He, her protector, turned and looked at her with empty eyes. He said nothing. He simply grabbed her arm, a rough grip, and dragged her toward the door. She must have looked at him with pleading, horrified, unbelieving eyes, but he did not look into her eyes. He just threw open the door and pushed her into the darkness, pushed her into the arms of the savage, waiting mob. He had saved himself by sacrificing her. He had convinced himself this was a necessary act, that the purity of a Levite was more important. That night, all of hell broke loose in Gibeah. The mob, like a pack of hungry wolves, tore her apart. They abused her, they tormented her, hour after hour, in the dark alleys of the city. They took everything from her, her dignity, her strength, her faith in humanity, and finally, her very life. And inside the house, two men sat in silence. They could hear her screams from a distance, screams that grew weaker and weaker until they faded into nothing. They had chosen their own safety, but the price was their souls. They had built a prison for their own conscience, a prison from which they would never escape. The long, horrific night in Gibeah finally passed. As the first faint, fragile rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky a pale pink, the mob, having finally sated its bestial urges, dispersed. They slunk away into the alleys and houses of their city, leaving behind a dead silence and the stench of their crime. Inside the old man's house, no one had slept. The air was thick with guilt and shame. The old man sat huddled by the dead hearth, his face having aged a decade in a single night. The Levite sat motionless in his chair, his eyes staring blankly into space. He showed no sign of grief or remorse. Perhaps he was busy building a wall in his mind to block out emotion, convincing himself that he had had no other choice, that the sacrifice was necessary. When the sun was fully risen, the Levite stood up. He was not hurried. There was no anxiety on his face. He simply adjusted his garments, retied his sash, and prepared to continue his journey, as if the night before had been just a bad dream to be forgotten. He walked to the door and opened it, and he saw her. She was lying there, on the very threshold, the line between safety and hell. Her body was collapsed in an unnatural posture, but her hands were still stretched forward, her slender fingers touching the wooden threshold. It was a haunting image, as if her very last act before her final ounce of strength gave out was to try to reach a place of safety, a place that had rejected and betrayed her. That outstretched hand was a silent accusation. The Levite looked down at the motionless form. He looked at her tangled hair, her torn clothes, and her body, which bore the marks of unspeakable brutality. But within him, it seemed no emotion stirred. Not a single tear, not a cry of pain. Only a cold, empty command. A sentence spoken to a living person, not a dead one. "Get up. Let us go." But she did not answer. She could never answer again. Her silence was the most powerful reply, more eloquent than any accusation. Only then, when he bent down and touched her cold arm, did he truly realize that she was dead. He said nothing more. He did not look at the old man, who stood frozen behind him. There were no prayers for the departed, no burial rites according to custom. He simply and silently lifted her body. It felt impossibly light in his arms. He slung it across the back of the donkey, as callously as one would load a sack of grain. Then he turned, leading the donkey and the trembling servant, and resumed his journey home. The journey back was now shrouded in a silence even heavier than the darkness of the previous night. The donkey walked heavily, carrying on its back the mute evidence of a nation's failure, a failure to protect the weak, a failure of hospitality, a failure of humanity. Each of its steps was like a hammer blow on the coffin of compassion. Her death on the threshold was not just the death of an individual. It was the death of compassion in the hearts of the men who pushed her out and silently listened. It was the death of righteousness in a city that called itself God's, and her outstretched hand was an eternal indictment, not just against those who had harmed her, but against the man who should have been her protector, and against a whole society that had allowed such rot to take root and grow. Sometimes silence is more terrifying than a scream. The silence of the Levite, the silence of the old man, and finally, the eternal silence of the concubine. Does that silence echo and condemn us today, when we turn our faces away from injustice, when we choose our own safety over speaking for those who have no voice? When the Levite returned to his cold stone house in Ephraim, the air inside was heavy with tragedy and emptiness. But in his heart, grief, if there was any, was quickly replaced by something else, something colder, sharper, and more powerful. A calculated rage. This was not the explosive anger of a grieving man, but the purposeful fury of a politician. He did not weep, he did not mourn, he did not beat his chest or tear his robes in the customary display of grief. He gently laid the body of his concubine on the floor. Then he entered his house, and his next action was one of the most shocking and horrifying in the entire Bible, an act whose brutality was matched only by the political calculation behind it. He took a knife, not a common kitchen knife, but a sharp blade, perhaps one used for ritual sacrifice, and with the body of the woman who had died in agony, the woman he had failed to protect, he performed the work of a butcher, methodically, coldly, without hesitation. He cut her body into 12 pieces, joint by joint, 12 pieces, for the 12 tribes of Israel. This was not the act of a man driven mad by grief. A madman would have acted chaotically. He, however, acted with a terrifying precision. This was a deliberate political act, a move that was as brutal as it was brilliant in its horror. He had turned her personal tragedy into a weapon. He had weaponized her body, turning each piece of flesh and bone into a letter, a declaration of war that could not be ignored, a message written in blood. He summoned messengers, gave each one a carefully wrapped parcel and a clear instruction. Take this throughout the territory of Israel. Give it to the elders, and tell them, consider this, take counsel, and speak up. Accompanying each parcel was a message that retold the story of the crime in Gibeah, but it was his version of the story. In his narrative, he was the primary victim, a Levite who had been humiliated, and the honor of the entire nation had been trampled by one of its own tribes. The death of the concubine was merely the evidence of that dishonor. Try to imagine it. One day, at the centers of power of each tribe, from Dan in the north to Simeon in the south, a gruesome package is delivered to the doors of the elders. When they open it, the stench of death rises. Inside is a human body part, and a story that makes their blood run cold. The Levite's gambit succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. It sent a political earthquake through the land. All of Israel was stunned and horrified. Elders, warriors, common folk, they all said to one another, "Such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day." He had gotten the attention he craved. He had successfully transformed his personal shame into national outrage. He had managed to divert attention from his own cowardice and focus it entirely on the crime of the Benjaminites. But how had he done it? By desecrating the memory and the physical integrity of the woman he had failed to protect in life. He denied her rest even in death. He was not seeking justice for her. He was seeking vengeance for his own honor. In our anger, we can justify the most terrible actions. We can believe that a noble end justifies brutal means. But when we use the pain and the bodies of others as weapons for our own cause, are we any different from the monsters we condemn? The Levite had lit a fire, but that fire would soon burn out of his control and consume the entire nation. The Levite's bloody message, carried by the swiftest runners, struck the conscience and the pride of the other 11 tribes. An unprecedented wave of fury rose from all over the land, from the hills of Naphtali to the valleys of Judah. They were not only horrified by the savage crime, but they were deeply humiliated that it had come from their own brothers, the tribe of Benjamin, a tribe famous for its fierce warriors. At Mizpah, a sacred gathering place, 400,000 warriors assembled a massive army, a sea of men and spears glittering under the sun. Their hearts burned with indignation and a resolve for retribution. The elders of the tribe stood, and the Levite was invited to tell his story once more. He spoke eloquently, full of a feigned grief, skillfully omitting his own role in the tragedy, and focusing only on the wickedness of the men of Gibeah and the indifference of the whole city. He succeeded in making himself the symbol of trampled innocence. The entire assembly roared in anger. They made a unanimous decision. None of us will go to his tent, and none of us will return to his house until this evil is purged from Israel. They sent a delegation to the tribe of Benjamin, delivering a clear and reasonable demand. Hand over the worthless men in Gibeah who have committed this crime, so that we may put them to death and cleanse the nation. It was a chance for redemption, an opportunity for the tribe of Benjamin to demonstrate its own righteousness, to purge itself, and to avoid a devastating war. But tribal pride, a misguided sense of honor, and a blind solidarity won out over reason. The elders of Benjamin refused. Instead of handing over the guilty men, they chose to protect them. They saw the demand of the other tribes as an interference in their internal affairs and an insult. They mobilized their own elite army, including 700 famous left-handed warriors who could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. They chose to side with the criminals instead of with justice and their brothers. And so the fire was lit. Civil war, brother against brother. The swords of the Israelites were no longer turned against their common enemies, like the Philistines or Canaanites, but against the very heart of their own nation. The battles were incredibly brutal. In the first 2 engagements, despite their superior numbers and having received God's permission to attack, the army of the 11 tribes was catastrophically defeated by the fierce Benjaminite warriors. Tens of thousands of men fell. Their initial arrogance was replaced by bewilderment and grief. They wept before the Lord, asking why they were failing. The wrath of man, even when cloaked in the mantle of divine justice, had become an indiscriminate hurricane of destruction. They were fighting in God's name, but their actions were driven by pride and hatred. Only in the 3rd battle, after they had learned a lesson in humility and devised a clever ambush, were they able to defeat the tribe of Benjamin. And when they won, their pent-up fury exploded without restraint. They slaughtered not only the warriors, but the people in the cities of Benjamin. They burned their cities to the ground, killing men, women, children, and livestock. The fire of vengeance consumed almost everything. When the smoke cleared, the victors looked upon the devastation they had wrought. The tribe of Benjamin, one of the 12 pillars of Israel, was nearly extinct. Their cities were ashes. Their people were dead. Only 600 men remained, having fled to hide in the wilderness at the rock of Rimmon. Looking at the desolate scene, for the first time, the victors felt a different emotion creep into their hearts, deep regret and a profound sense of loss. They had started the war in the name of justice, but in the end, they were left with a broken nation, a tribe on the brink of annihilation, and a haunting question that echoed across the land. Why has this happened in Israel? Their quest for justice, unchecked by mercy, had created a new tragedy, a scar that would never fully heal in the history of their people. Standing amidst the smoldering ruins of the tribe of Benjamin, the elders of the 11 tribes of Israel finally awoke from the blood-drunk madness of their revenge. The elation of victory quickly gave way to a deep sorrow and regret. They looked at each other, and in each other's eyes they saw their shared loss. At Bethel, the house of God, they sat and wept bitterly until evening. "O Lord, God of Israel," they cried, Why has this disaster happened? Today, a tribe has been cut off from Israel. They realized that in their fury, they had nearly amputated a part of their own body. Now they faced a new problem, a problem of their own making. How to restore the tribe of Benjamin when only 600 men were left, and no women. In their anger, they had taken a rash oath, swearing that none of them would ever give his daughter in marriage to a Benjaminite. That oath, made in the heat of the moment, now became a barrier to the very survival of the tribe. And once again, in a tragically repeating pattern, instead of humbly seeking God's guidance and forgiveness, they relied on human cunning and schemes. They tried to patch up a spiritual wound with worldly solutions, solutions that only created more violence and pain. First, they remembered that they had also sworn an oath that any city that did not come to the holy war assembly at Mizpah would be put to death. They checked the records and discovered that no one from the city of Jabesh-Gilead had attended. So, justice was again used as a pretext for violence. They sent an army of 12,000 men to Jabesh, slaughtering everyone, men, married women, and children. They only spared 400 virgin girls, whom they captured and brought back to be wives for the Benjaminites. Violence begat violence. The pain of the woman in Gibeah was now being fixed with the blood and tears of the innocent people of Jabesh. But this brutal solution was still not enough. There were still 200 Benjaminite men without wives, and so they devised a plan that was even more cunning and shameless. They created a legal loophole in their own oath. They told the remaining men of Benjamin, "Go to Shiloh, where there is an annual festival to the Lord. Lie in ambush in the vineyards. When the young women of Shiloh come out to dance, rush out, and each of you seize a wife for himself and return to your land. If their fathers or brothers come to us to complain, we will say, 'Be generous to them, for we did not take a wife for each of them in battle, and you are not guilty, for you did not voluntarily give your daughters to them, so you have not broken your oath.'" And so, the story ends with a haunting and tragic image. 200 innocent women, joyfully dancing in a religious festival, are suddenly seized in terror and screams. They are carried off, forced into marriage with strangers, survivors of a massacre, all to perpetuate a lineage. The cycle of tragedy continued, in which women were always the victims, the pawns sacrificed for honor, for vengeance, and for the political solutions of men. This story has no happy ending. It does not end with true repentance or divine healing. It ends with a cold diagnosis for an entire era, an explanation for all the horror that had transpired, a sentence that echoes like a mournful sigh of history. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. When there is no supreme moral authority, when the law of God is ignored, when every person makes themselves the standard for right and wrong, society collapses into a black hole of selfishness and violence. The story of the Levite and his concubine was not an isolated incident. It was the symptom of a much larger disease, a disease that had eaten into the very soul of the nation. So what does this story leave us with? It leaves a warning, a call. It forces us to ask ourselves, who is king in our own lives? Is it our own ego, our pride, our desires? Or is it something higher, more sacred, and more compassionate? Because even in the ashes of Israel's failure, God did not abandon them. His grace, though unsought, still found a crack in which to sprout. The tribe of Benjamin, from the brink of extinction, was restored. And many centuries later, from this same small and once rejected tribe, the first king of Israel, Saul, would emerge. And later still, one of the greatest apostles of the faith, Paul, would also come from their line. Grace does not erase the scars of the past, but it can redeem the story and bring forth a new future. The final question this story leaves, echoing through millennia, is not for them. It is for you and for me. In the kingdom of your own life, who sits on the throne?